Greetings, and welcome to this lecture on digital media literacy. Until recently, I had limited this lecture to website evaluation, but the digital media landscape has grown so vast with so many different products that I realized focusing on websites was misleading. I also realized that you can use the same evaluation techniques for most digital research sources that you would use on websites alone. For our purposes, digital media includes websites, of course, and also blog posts, podcasts, news sites, social media, and the wide variety of other products designed to make information available. When we talk about digital media, we're not talking about articles, books, newspapers, and magazines delivered electronically. Those are similar to their paper analogs. Digital media is different. Its most pronounced characteristic is that there is a low barrier to entry. It is essentially self-publishing. Think about it. There's scads of free website hosts, and though building a site might be frustrating, its bare bones of information requires only a modest learning curve. A web author can go from paper to published work in mere minutes. Blogging is even faster. An hour to secure and establish a site with a web editor program, and the blogger can start writing. Same for a podcast, as I can attest. All you need is a way to digitally record voices, a host for the recordings like SoundCloud, and the ability to link the host to distribution services via RSS feed. Boom, you're on the air. YouTube, TikTok, and more let you star in your own show. The key is that it doesn't cost much money or time to accomplish, and it's wildly democratic. There are few gatekeepers. Only if your information is so bad that it runs afoul of the host's term of service will it ever be subject to scrutiny. Post-publication scrutiny is another thing, as you've learned if you've ever been flamed in the comments. But the author's work is out there for all to see, whether it's right or wrong. That information is unfiltered. That is, it's not vetted or edited, which are types of gatekeeping mechanisms that arose during the print and expertise eras of the 20th century. We'll discuss vetting and editing as gatekeeping and filtering in a moment. So anyway, why are low barriers to entry and lack of gatekeeping problems? Here we're concerned with accurate, authentic, valid, and reliable information. One problem with unvetted, unfiltered information is how we receive it. We tend to over-respect particularly written information. We're not skeptical enough of it because the written information we've used in the past has been vetted and edited, at least to some extent. We also have developed techniques to decide if our sources are trustworthy. But this is a new era, and we have to devise new techniques and habits. A second problem with the Wild West of digital media is that so much of it is emotional, personal viewpoints and even biased. Someone trying to convince us of something using manipulative techniques. Furthermore, it's so easy to slip into information-seeking behavior that confirms your own biases. There's so much information available at a click or two that it's easy to slip into an information bubble. So what is this vetting and editing business, and how is it different from digital media? Remember, when we use the label digital media, we're not talking about works that might be delivered digitally, but which are vetted and edited in a traditional manner. When we identify a work as being vetted and edited, it means it's gone through the peer review process. The American Historical Association defines peer review in its 2009 Statement on Peer Review for Historical Research to mean, quote, a manuscript will be read and evaluated by other scholars with expertise in the time period, subject matter, languages, and documents with which the author deals, unquote. The AHA goes on with a history of the process. that it was rooted in the expansion of knowledge professions in the 19th and 20th centuries. That became a formal process after World War II. Peer review is not foolproof, but we have relied on it in scholarly and professional fields to help us winnow out error and malfeasance in the knowledge production process. Like the reputation of publishers and journals, peer review is a talisman of at least a serious attempt to get it right the first time. The peer review process has many steps. It begins with the author submitting a manuscript to a journal. If the editor deems it appropriate for that journal, it goes to readers, usually two. They critically read the manuscript for how well the manuscript adheres to professional standards of method and knowledge of current research, how accurate it is, how valid and reliable its information. There are other considerations such as fit for the journal or publishing house in case of a book, the audience, the commercial appeal in some cases, and other things. These readers then make comments and they ask questions called inquiries. That goes back to the author. The author then addresses each inquiry by altering the manuscript or explaining why reader 2 is mean and bad and should be ignored. Y'all, this is a joke. When the author resubmits, the manuscript often goes through another round of reviews and inquiries. Eventually, the editor accepts the manuscript for publication. Then it goes through a copy editor. When the process is fully completed, there's one more step. The editor sends the author galley proofs, a printout of what the manuscript looks like in published book or article form. The author has one last chance to repair any errors they find in the galleys. Then the work is published and other authors formally review it if it's a book or address it in their own articles and books. This is exacting to the point of exhaustion and sometimes takes years from first submission to publication. Almost every published scholar will tell you stories about their own adventures in peer review, which is where that joke about the incompetence of reader 2 originates. But digital media doesn't work that way. It is, for all intents and purposes, self-publishing. So consumers have to do their own reviewing. It is indeed caveat lector, let the reader beware. But we do have characteristics to check that give us greater or lesser confidence that a source is valid, reliable, and authentic. That is to say, we have methods to do for a source what peer review would have done had the source gone through it. We evaluate these characteristics not on a binary of good versus bad, but on a dialectic, a Likert scale, if you will, that goes through stages from completely competent and useful down through incompetent and useless. Some sources will fall into those two categories. Those are the ones that you rely upon and the ones that you'll discard. But most fall somewhere in between. So you have to decide how much faith to put into any particular source. Don't let this bother you too much. If you use a source that you have less faith in, talk about that source in your analysis, in your paper. Tell us what the problems are. Here's an example. I used a series of annual press releases to determine how many people showed up for a particular event. It was the only source for that information, and it did report annually. There were many problems with that source. The author was biased and self-interested, and the numbers were far too facile. They matched numbers being reported in other locations with which my author was in competition. So I used the source, but discussed in the body of my manuscript why that source was dicey and why I used it anyway. It wasn't a great source, but it provided an idea of what had happened, and it was useful to compare with other states and to compare from year to year. If the evidence isn't solid, you might still be able to use it, but you do have to warn your reader. When evaluating a digital source, I begin and advise you to do the same by examining the nature of the platform that carries the work. This is like evaluating the reputation of a books publisher or the journal an article is published in. What's the URL? Is it a .com, which is the cheapest domain to buy, a .org, a .edu, or a .gov of some sort? Organizations that pride themselves on truth-telling or have a mandate to provide accurate information rank higher than domains that have other agendas. One of those agendas is commerce or money-making. Is the host platform commercial or non-commercial? If it's commercial, clicks and ad sales drive publication. And we all know that clickbait sites are not as committed to validity as sites that have a non-commercial revenue stream. Commercial sites are not bad per se, but to have a higher confidence in them, you have to evaluate the impact of that commercialism on the quality of the information. Whether a site is commercial or not, examine the work's author. Where on the scale of authority and expertise does that author fall? Are they expert enough in the field to give you high confidence in their validity and reliability? That can change based on the relationship of the author to the site as well as to the field. For example, an author's personal website that talks about their works and achievements is probably pretty accurate and worthy. But what about a site in which the author is opining about a field outside of their knowledge base? Don't commit the logical fallacy of thinking that an expert in one field is an expert in another field too. So judge the validity and reliability of a digital product's author as you would a hard copy. Is the author qualified to make the statements therein? This also speaks to the content itself. Just as with a hard copy, do you have higher or lower confidence that the content is valid and reliable? Remember, validity tests accuracy of work against known information and with internal consistency within that work. If a work gets facts incorrect or says one thing in one place and a different thing in another, when those two things should be the same, those are earmarks of a problematic document. At a lower level, the same applies to grammar, mechanics, and citation formatting. If the author can't be bothered with correcting these things, do you have a greater or lesser confidence in that person's information and interpretation? It goes to the author's intellectual ethos. Reliability is a test of the work when you compare it to similar works rather than comparing it with itself. As with a publication, is the digital work more or less in line with other works on the same subject? That's not to question its creativity, but to assure that the creativity hasn't become fiction. Another characteristic of the site or work to check is the date of publication. Same with hard copies. The currency of the site does not affect its information necessarily, but like older publications, it's an artifact of its time. An old work's interpretations and even its data may not be up to date, which gives you a lower confidence in its validity and reliability. Can't find a date on the face of the site or on the other work? Check for a copyright date somewhere on the overall site or even in the HTML code that you can access for a web publication by clicking Control and U. Lastly, and this works more with digitally printed material like websites and blogs than with other media, is to check the site's navigation. This can be another determinant of commercialism and concern with clicks or revenue rather than veracity. Or it could indicate a problem with currency of the site and information. This is particularly true if a site or blog has dead links. The question to ask is softer than the others, as there's no hard answer. But does the navigation of the site inspire confidence to a greater or to a lesser degree? Let's look at an example of a website and go through some of these characteristics. If you're interested in the civil rights movement as a topic and you conduct a Google search of digital sources, that is a general Google search rather than Google Books or Google Scholar, this site is likely to show up on the first page of hits. Look at it for a moment. It's a very simple site from a very different time in the history of the internet. From the outside in, let's examine some of the characteristics we discussed in the previous slide. What's the nature of the host platform? That is www.watson.org. It's hard to tell from this page, so I did a search on the domain itself and found a single page listing resources mostly about history, as well as a number of user homepages. This is an old school amalgamator page used by people with things to say online before everyone bought domains for themselves. There's nothing particularly commercial about it. It's just a host page that takes no responsibility for what's posted below the top level domain unless that falls outside reasonable decency. Some of the users haven't touched their pages in years, which is not unusual, while others update occasionally. It appears most of the users began when they were students. This is a self-publishing site. What of the expertise and authority of the author of this digital product? Her name is Lisa Cozens, who did this project as part of her 12th grade senior project in 1998. Prowling through the various links via the Watson website leads me to believe that she was at Sidwell Friends School in Washington, D.C., a high-end private academy that tracks students of the wealthy and powerful into high-end colleges. So, a 12th grader publishing a class project might not inspire confidence in her expertise, but my confidence goes up because of her school. Not far, mind you, but Sidwell Friends has a reputation for academic orientation and high standards, and I'm aware of that reputation. So I'll explore this site further to see if it's useful. Looking at the content reliability and validity, we can begin checking this page. Her explanation at the top of the page seems reasonable. I might quibble with some of her periodization, but it's not wrong, and her dates for the event she lists are accurate. Now look at this list of topics that she'll cover. These are all well-known chapters in civil rights movement history, and she has arranged them in chronological order without error. So far, so good. Let's look at one of these topics, the Montgomery bus boycott. Arriving at this page, we see the same flat text-based presentation, which was typical of how the web operated in 1998. We also see that the author has included citations. Clicking any citation number takes you to the citation page, a portion of which I have copied here. Her quotation comes from the Casher book, as you can see, and her citation formatting is almost perfect. It's missing a comma before the page numbers, so I have confidence that she pays attention to the details, but that it is her who has done the work. The tiny punctuation error tells me that, because it is typical of someone with her experience level. If we continue to read the first two paragraphs, we see there is a good deal of detail, none of which is incorrect, and all of which is rendered well. Reading beyond this snippet gives me high confidence in the reliability and validity of this source, as well as a reference source that relied on all secondary sources and is a narrative of events. Where we begin to lose confidence is in the site's currency. It was published in 1998 and does not appear to have been updated. That makes sense given the nature of her project. What does that do to our evaluation of the information as a reference source? Well, there are newer pieces of information about the Montgomery bus boycott that have come to light since 1998. But this author's basic narrative is not diminished by the passage of only 20 years or so. The publication date makes me cringe a little, but we know almost nothing new that would alter what she's written here. Site navigation is the final consideration for us at this time. Navigation is very simple in keeping with the limits and considerations of web design in 1998. Straightforward links at the top of the page take you almost anywhere you want to go in the author's work, though they do not appear to get you back to the watson.org homepage. This is an old school website produced by a high school senior to show off her capstone project. She chose a low-cost, probably free aggregator site that appeared to have some potential to attract attention, and both her and the site's concern appear to be sharing information rather than making money. Face it, we've all relied on much dicier websites for our research. Let's look now at how to operationalize examining digital media critically. It's not enough to know that you must be digitally literate to do solid research, as well as weave your way through our brave new world of unvetted and unedited information. It's also not enough to know only what to look for as you deal with digital sources. You must also have an easy to remember operational plan. So let me introduce you to the Sift technique proposed by Mike Caulfield and available at the blog post at the URL you see here. Sift has 4 steps. Stop. When you encounter a digital source, stop for a moment to evaluate it. Implement the other steps. Also remember, in doing so, to stop again when you find yourself going down a rabbit hole of information. Step 2 is to investigate the source. Ask if the author and host are reputable using the information we discussed earlier. Look for an agenda and a potential bias. Remember, everyone has a point of view, and seeing one present in a source does not mean that you shouldn't use that source. Just be aware, particularly when a point of view becomes biased. Step 3 is to find trusted coverage for comparison. This is especially true for the claim, and it's what we called earlier reliability, that is, conformity with other sources. Seek out a source of information you know is authoritative, valid, and reliable. Judge how well the new information compares with the earlier info. Finally, and this is particularly important when you look at video clips or similar graphics, trace the info back to its original context. Far too many people use a truth to tell a lie by taking the truth out of context. They can claim they've not manipulated their so-called evidence, but outside of the original context, the evidence can manipulate how you understand it. This is no different from looking up a writer's info in the sources they cited in their footnotes, though digital media has its own tools like reverse image searching. So remember, when you encounter digital info, to sift it, stop, investigate, find, and trace. To summarize, this lecture has concerned ways that we can avoid what Bart did to find himself writing on the board in our illustration. You should not blindly trust information you find online. So we've laid out some tools to help you evaluate online information and become more digitally literate. We noted that digital media has low entry barriers, that almost anyone can post whatever information they want, and our own bias in favor of believing what we see in print and online can lead us into trouble. One of the differences between self-published data info and other published information is the idea of vetting and editing through peer review. Standard since the mid-20th century, peer review helps sort reliable information from poor quality information. Digital media often lacks this, though there is plenty of vetted and edited sources delivered electronically. Next, we talked about what to look for when evaluating digital sources, the questions you should ask of it. I went through an older website to show you how to apply those questions. Finally, we learned the Sift technique for appraising digital sources. Stop, investigate, find, and trace. I hope you can and will practice safe digital sourcing. Remember, it's a caveat lector world online. Let the reader beware. This ends the lecture. As always, thank you for your attention.